Welcome to Sociology Droids. We're going to dive into David Beer's punk sociology today.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a dense book. So
It is dense.
we're going to try to unpack it, give you all the good stuff you need, the arguments,
Ah.
the data he uses, the methodology, claims, conclusions.
All the good stuff a grad student needs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's do it.
Let's get started. So Beer kicks things off
Okay.
by arguing that sociology is in a state of uncertainty.
Right. Yeah, he kind of posits that sociology is in a crisis.
Yeah.
And this feeling fragmented, maybe lacking a little self-esteem.
A crisis of confidence.
A crisis of confidence, exactly.
I mean, it does feel like sociology is always in some kind of crisis, though.
You know, it's funny you say that because he kind of addresses that in the book.
Yeah.
He argues that this feeling of fragmentation, of uncertainty, that's been around for a while, it's not new.
Okay.
He points to other sociologists like Arthur Stinchcombe,
Right.
who called it a disintegrated discipline because of how specialized all the subfields have become. And then he cites Andrew Abbott, too, who argues that, sociology kind of lacks a shared project.
Yeah.
And that makes it vulnerable to attacks from the outside.
So sociologists are struggling to connect with each other's work
Mm-hmm.
and defend the discipline as a whole.
Right.
Because everybody's just stuck in their own little niche.
Yeah. And so Beer's argument is this makes it hard for sociology to stand strong against those outside pressures,
Right.
like the neoliberal academy and austerity measure.
Yeah, the joys of shrinking budgets.
Exact.
Endless metrics.
All that fun stuff.
So where does this punk sociology thing come in?
Well, before we even get to applying it to sociology, we need to understand the punk ethos itself.
Okay.
Beer emphasizes that punk is about more than just music or fashion.
Hi.
It's a way of thinking that challenges norms, hierarchies, and conventions.
So it's not about like listening to the Sex Pistols while you write your dissertation.
Not exactly. No, although that could be fun.
Maybe for some people.
But Beer really dives into the history of punk and uses all these great stories and quotes to kind of illustrate this rebellious ethos. For example, he points to Malcolm McLaren's gravestone, which reads, "Better a spectacular failure than a benign success."
That's pretty punk rock.
It really sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's about taking risks and not being afraid to fail.
Exactly. And then Beer also talks about how John Lydon, or Johnny Rotten,
Right.
rejected labels and titles. He has this great quote, "It's meaningless. Once you accept a title like that, you are a slave to the system."
So punk is about rejecting conformity and embracing individual expression.
Yeah.
But isn't there a danger of taking that too far?
That's interesting.
I mean, could too much individualism lead to chaos?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's something that Beer actually grapples with throughout the book. But he argues that punk also embraces this kind of relativism.
Yeah.
The idea that there isn't one right way to do things.
Okay.
It's about challenging those assumptions and being open to different perspectives.
So you're saying that punk sociology is encouraging us to find value in unexpected places like pop culture, instead of sticking to just academic journals.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Beer highlights how punk finds value in things that are often dismissed by mainstream society, and he really celebrates diverse contributions.
Yeah.
He even uses this really provocative question.
No.
What is better, Shakespeare or The Simpsons?
Wow. Okay, what's the answer?
A punk sociologist would say The Simpsons.
Really?
It's about challenging those ingrained assumptions about what we consider to be valuable and being open to different forms of knowledge.
That's pretty radical.
It is a little radical, right?
Okay, so how does Beer actually connect this punk ethos to the practice of sociology?
His big argument is that this punk ethos can be a really powerful force for revitalizing the whole discipline.
Okay,
It's not about studying punk rock itself.
gotcha.
It's about using that punk way of thinking as a lens for approaching your research, your knowledge creation, and communication.
So it's about breaking down those barriers between the researcher and the researched,
Yes.
between academia and the public.
Precisely. He emphasizes that a lot. For example, he talks about how punk bands often broke down that barrier between the performer and the audience and created this more interactive and participatory experience. Yeah. He wants to see that same energy in sociology.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So how does this actually play out in those different elements of sociological work?
Okay.
He breaks it down into punk knowledge, punk communication, and punk terrain. I like that.
Exactly. So let's start with punk knowledge.
Okay.
Beer argues that punk sociology encourages a more relativistic approach to knowledge. Instead of viewing academic sociology as the sole authority, it embraces a lot of diverse forms of social knowledge.
So Things like film literature,
Yeah.
even The Simpsons, as we just discussed.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not about dismissing traditional sociological knowledge,
Hmm.
but expanding our understanding of where knowledge can come from. So in a way, punk sociology is kind of embracing that interdisciplinary approach that's becoming more popular in academia.
That's a really good point. He definitely seems to be pushing for a more inclusive and expansive understanding of what counts as sociological knowledge.
Okay.
And he wants to blur those lines between what we consider highbrow and lowbrow,
Right.
really challenging those traditional hierarchies of knowledge.
That's fascinating.
Hmm.
It seems like this could lead to some really interesting and unconventional research projects.
It could.
But does he give any specific examples?
He does. He spends quite a bit of time on that. He highlights work from scholars like Lesbach, for instance,
Okay.
who have used ethnographic methods to study things like street culture and urban life.
Yeah.
He sees this as embodying that punk spirit
Right.
because it's going outside of those traditional academic spaces
Right.
and engaging with the people and communities that are often overlooked or marginalized.
So it's not just about the sources of knowledge, but also the methods we use to gather it. It sounds like punk sociology encourages a more grounded and participatory approach to research.
Absolutely. And he also stresses the importance of challenging those ingrained assumptions about what constitutes valid knowledge.
Okay.
He's pretty critical of those rigid positivist approaches that dominate certain areas of sociology.
Good.
He argues that they can really limit our understanding of the social world.
So it's about being open to new perspectives and new ways of seeing things,
Right.
which kind of ties back to that whole punk ethos of challenging conventions.
Absolutely. And this openness to diverse forms of knowledge also extends to how punk sociology views the relationship between the researcher and those being researched.
Okay, so it's not just about what we study,
Mhm.
but how we study it
Yeah,
and who we involve in that process.
exactly.
Does he suggest any specific ways to break down those barriers between the researcher and the researched?
He points to scholars like Shamas Khan who advocate for a more sociable social science, where researchers work with participants and not on them. He even argues that punk sociology can kind of blur the lines between sociologists and their audience,
Oh.
create a more participatory and dialogical approach to research.
That's a pretty radical departure from the traditional model of like that detached, objective researcher.
It is.
It sounds like punk sociology is all about challenging those power dynamics and creating a more collaborative research environment.
Exactly. And this ties into another key element of punk knowledge, challenging the status quo.
Okay.
Beer argues that punk sociology is about asking bold new questions and questioning those established norms and assumptions that can really limit our understanding of the social world.
So it's not just about embracing different sources of knowledge, but also being willing to look at the world from a fresh perspective
Yeah.
and finding those blind spots that maybe traditional sociology has missed.
Right. He even suggests that this willingness to question those conventions can open up entirely new areas of inquiry
Okay.
and lead to more insightful analyses.
I'm starting to see how this punk ethos could really shake things up in sociology.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about it.
I'm curious about how this translates to actually communicating sociological knowledge.
Okay.
Because, academic writing can be so dense and jargon-filled.
It can.
How does punk sociology address that?
That's a great question. And that's a great segue to the next element of punk sociology, communication.
Okay.
This is where his whole comparison of punk sociology to prog sociology comes in.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is prog sociology?
He's using it to critique the tendency for some sociological writing to be really dense,
Okay.
jargon-filled,
Yeah.
and more focused on technical virtuosity
Right.
than on actually clearly communicating those ideas.
You mean like those long, self-indulgent guitar solos in prog rock?
Exactly.
Okay.
He argues that this kind of writing alienates audiences and makes sociology inaccessible to anyone outside of this small circle of academics.
So it's about stripping things back, being direct, even embracing those limitations.
Yeah.
Is he saying we all start writing like we're tweeting?
Not necessarily, but he is advocating for a more raw and fearless approach to communicating sociological ideas. Remember, punk is all about challenging those fears and inhibitions.
Right.
He wants sociologists to be bolder in their writing, to take more risks and not be so afraid of being criticized.
It's about making sociology more accessible and engaging for a wider audience.
Yeah.
So ditching the academic jargon, embracing a more conversational style,
Yeah.
maybe incorporating things like blog posts or podcasts or short films.
All of that, yeah.
Yeah.
He even suggests embracing that unpredictable nature of social media as a way to kind of disseminate work.
Interesting. So punk sociology is all about breaking down those barriers between academia and the public,
Yes.
not just in terms of the research, but also in how we communicate our findings.
Right.
It's about making sociology part of that everyday conversation.
Exactly. And this ties into his call for sociologists to be more mobile in their thinking and their research. Not getting stuck in a rut, being open to new ideas, new approaches, constantly adapting to that changing social world.
So punk sociology is dynamic responsive, always evolving.
Yeah.
It's not about clinging to some rigid set of rules or methods, but constantly pushing those boundaries
Right.
and finding new ways to engage with the social world.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about punk knowledge, punk communication,
Right,
but there's one more key element we need to explore, the punk terrain.
right. That refers to the spaces where sociological research is conducted and the types of questions we ask.
Yeah.
So how does the punk ethos apply to that?
Beer argues that punk sociology encourages boldness and inventiveness in how we approach our research.
Okay.
He challenges sociologists to be more daring in their choice of topics and methods,
Okay.
to really push those boundaries and explore uncharted territory.
So it's about being fearless and taking those intellectual risks.
Yeah.
What kind of risks is he talking about?
Well, he points to the fact that, a lot of those early punk bands adopted a very DIY, do-it-yourself ethic.
Right.
They were self-producing their music,
Mhm.
creating their own zines. And he wants to see that same DIY spirit in sociology. He encourages researchers to be resourceful
Okay.
and, find creative solutions when they're faced with limited resources.
So punk sociology is about being scrappy,
Yeah.
adaptable,
Mm-hmm.
always finding a way to make things happen,
Right.
even when those traditional funding sources or that institutional support isn't there.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be really empowering for young sociologists who are just starting out
Right.
and who might not have access to those resources.
Absolutely. He also emphasizes the importance of challenging authority,
Okay.
even within academia itself. He argues that punk sociologists should be willing to question those established power structures and hierarchies
Okay.
that can sometimes stifle innovation and critical thinking.
So punk sociology is also about challenging those gatekeepers and making the discipline more inclusive and accessible to those who maybe haven't traditionally had a voice in sociological discourse.
Exactly.
That's a powerful idea.
It is. And this all ties into his idea of expanding the sociological terrain.
Okay.
He argues that we should be more open to studying new and unconventional areas of social life,
Okay.
looking beyond those traditional sociological topics and asking those new and thought-provoking questions.
It's about pushing those boundaries
Yeah.
and recognizing that sociological insight can come from anywhere, not just from those with fancy degrees or prestigious positions within academia.
Right. And he even suggests that this boldness and inventiveness
Yeah.
can make sociology more attractive to future generations,
Oh, that's a good point.
making it more relevant, more edgy, and more exciting.
That's a really important point. If we want sociology to thrive in the 21st century, we need to find ways to make it resonate with young people who are facing this whole new set of social challenges and complexities.
Absolutely. So to sum up this first part of our deep dive into punk sociology, Beer is essentially arguing that we can revitalize the discipline by injecting it with that punk spirit of rebellion, creativity, and that DIY ethos.
He's calling for a sociology that's more inclusive, more engaged with the public,
Yeah.
and more willing to challenge those established norms and power structures that can sometimes limit our understanding of the social world.
Exactly. But like you mentioned earlier, there are some potential downsides to this approach.
Right.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of those critiques and challenges of punk sociology.
Okay.
And we're going to consider whether it can actually deliver on its promise of revitalizing the discipline.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to Sociology Droids.
All right, so we spent the last segment getting all fired up about punk sociology.
We did.
Now I think it's time to get a little more cynical.
Okay, I like it.
I have to admit some of Beer's ideas sound really appealing.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering if this whole punk approach is a little too idealistic. Can it really work in the real world?
Right.
In the messy, complex world of academia?
Well, Beer actually addresses those concerns head on.
Okay.
In the last chapter of the book, he explores what he calls the pathology of punk.
Pathology of punk. That sounds kind of ominous.
It does sound a little ominous, doesn't it?
What does he mean by that?
He's not saying that punk sociology is inherently bad or flawed,
Yeah.
but he's acknowledging that there are some potential downsides we need to be aware of.
Okay.
For example, that relativism we talked about earlier,
Right.
the idea that there isn't one right way to do things.
Yeah.
Well, he points out that that can also lead to fragmentation and a lack of coherence.
So too much individualism could undermine the collective goals of the movement.
That's one of his concerns, yeah.
If everyone's off doing their own thing, embracing their own unique approach, could it weaken the discipline as a whole?
That's what he worries about, and he points to how this actually played out in the punk movement itself. There were often tensions and disagreements between different bands and individuals, each with their own vision of what punk should be.
Right.
And this lack of unity sometimes made it difficult for the movement to achieve its goals.
I see what you mean. It's like that old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth.
Exactly.
So how does Beer propose we navigate that tension between individual expression and collective identity within punk sociology?
He doesn't offer any easy answers,
Okay.
but he stresses the importance of finding some common ground, some shared values or goals that can unite punk sociologists, even if they have different approaches.
So it's about recognizing that we're all on the same team, even if we're playing different positions.
Yeah.
We need to find ways to collaborate and support each other, even if we don't always agree on everything.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, another potential pitfall that Beer identifies is the risk of punk sociology becoming too reactionary or nihilistic.
Meaning just being anti-establishment for the sake of it,
Yeah.
without offering any constructive alternative.
That's the danger he's highlighting. He argues that punk sociology needs to be more than just a knee-jerk reaction against tradition.
Right.
It needs to offer concrete solutions and ways forward.
So it's not enough to just critique the status quo. You need to have a vision for what you want to replace it with.
I think that's a key part of it.
But isn't there a risk that punk sociology could just descend into this kind of unproductive cynicism?
That is a valid concern, and Beer acknowledges that. He stresses that punk sociology needs to be both critical and constructive,
Okay.
rebellious and responsible.
I'm starting to see where things get tricky.
Yeah,
How do you strike that balance between tearing things down and building something new?
it's a tough one. He argues that it requires a lot of self-reflection
Okay.
and careful thought. Punk sociologists need to be clear about their goals and what they're trying to achieve. And he also suggests that engaging in dialogue with other sociologists, even those who might not share their punk perspective, can help refine those ideas and make them more constructive.
So it's not about isolating yourself in a bubble of pure punk ideology, but being open to different perspectives.
Yes.
And finding ways to kind of bridge those divides.
Exactly. Now, another concern that Beer raises is the danger of punk sociology becoming too trendy or superficial.
Yes. The danger of punk washing.
Exactly.
What if it just becomes this way for sociologists to seem cool or edgy
Right.
without really embracing that true spirit of punk?
He's definitely aware of that risk. He uses the example of, the band The Clash being used to sell everything from jeans to credit cards.
Right.
He argues that punk sociology can't just be about aesthetics. It has to be grounded in a genuine commitment to challenging power structures and making sociology more inclusive.
So it's about substance over style.
Yeah.
But how do you ensure that punk sociology doesn't just become another empty fad in academia?
He emphasizes the importance of staying true to those core punk values.
Okay.
Challenging conventions, questioning authority, embracing that DIY ethos. It's not just about adopting the punk aesthetic. It's about embodying that punk spirit in your work.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's another big elephant in the room that we need to address.
Okay.
Can punk sociology really thrive in the current academic environment?
Right.
I mean, we're talking about the neoliberal academy.
Yeah.
With its emphasis on metrics, competition, and conformity.
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem like the total antithesis of the punk ethos?
That's a really important point. And Beer doesn't shy away from those challenges.
Oh.
He admits that it won't be easy to practice punk sociology in an environment that often prioritizes metrics over meaning and conformity over creativity.
It's like the system is rigged against punk sociology from the start.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah.
But Beer argues that punk sociologists can't let those limitations defeat them.
Okay.
He sees punk sociology as a form of resistance,
Mm-hmm.
a way to push back against those forces that are trying to constrain and control academic work.
So it's about finding ways to work within the system while still pushing those boundaries.
Yeah.
But how do you do that without either selling out or getting crushed by the system?
Beer suggests that punk sociologists need to be strategic and resourceful.
Okay.
Finding those cracks in the system where they can carve out space for their work.
Okay.
For example, he points to the growing popularity of open access journals and alternative publishing platforms as ways to kind of circumvent the traditional gatekeepers of academic knowledge.
So you're saying it's about being both rebellious and pragmatic, finding those creative ways to make punk sociology work within the constraints of the neoliberal academy.
Exactly. He even argues that punk sociologists can use those very metrics that are often used to control and limit academic work to their advantage.
How so?
He suggests, for instance, that punk sociologists could focus on publishing in high-impact journals, not because they value those metrics, but because it gives them a platform to reach a wider audience and potentially influence the direction of the discipline.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
So it's not about rejecting the system altogether, but finding ways to subvert it and use it to your own ends.
Exactly. And remember, punk is all about resilience and adaptability.
Right.
Those are key qualities for any punk sociologist who wants to make a real impact in the current academic climate.
Okay, so we've explored some of the potential downsides of punk sociology.
We have.
But let's not forget those potential benefits that we talked about earlier.
Right.
How does Beer ultimately weigh those two sides? Does he believe that punk sociology can live up to its hype?
He ends the book on this cautiously optimistic note.
Okay.
He acknowledges those challenges, but believes that punk sociology has the potential to really reinvigorate the discipline and make it more relevant to the contemporary world.
So he sees it as one possible path forward.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the path,
Right.
but a path worth exploring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also reminds us that punk sociology is ultimately about more than just a set of methods or theories.
Oh.
It's about a way of thinking, a commitment to challenging the status quo and making sociology a force for positive change in the world.
It's about bringing that passion, that energy, and that critical spirit to everything we do as sociologists.
Yes.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Right.
What advice does Beer offer to those budding sociologists out there who are maybe considering embracing this punk ethos in their own work?
Well, first and foremost, he stresses the importance of being reflexive and critical.
Okay.
Don't just blindly follow the punk script.
Right.
Think about how those principles of relativism, boldness, a DIY spirit can be applied to your specific research interests and goals.
It's about finding your own unique punk sociology voice.
Yes.
Not just mimicking what others have done, but figuring out what punk sociology means for you and your work.
Exactly. And be prepared for challenges.
Okay.
Punk sociology isn't always easy or comfortable. You might face resistance from those who are more invested in those traditional approaches.
Right.
Or you might struggle to find your place within those existing academic structures.
But don't let that discourage you.
No.
Remember, punk is all about resilience and finding those creative solutions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment and push those boundaries.
Okay.
That's how you're going to make new discoveries and contribute to the growth of the discipline.
Punk sociology is all about breaking the rules.
Yeah.
But it's also about knowing which rules to break and how to break them effectively.
Right. And most importantly, Beer reminds us to have fun.
Okay.
Punk sociology is about bringing that passion and that energy to your work.
Right.
If you're not enjoying it, what's the point?
So let's all channel our inner punk rocker
Yeah.
and make sociology a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more relevant,
Yeah.
and a whole lot more exciting.
I love it.
Now that we've explored both the potential and the pitfalls of Beer's punk sociology, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll consider how this approach fits into the broader landscape of the discipline. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap things up and offer some final thoughts on the legacy of punk sociology. Welcome back to Sociology, droids. We've been really getting into this punk sociology.
Yeah, a deep dive for sure.
Yeah, really thrashing around in it.
Totally.
We've looked at all of the core arguments,
We have.
weighed the benefits against the limitations, even poke at some of the contradictions. Now let's zoom out a little bit
Okay.
and see where this punk sociology fits within the bigger discipline.
Sounds good.
Remember how Beer keeps coming back to that sense of uncertainty,
Right.
crisis in sociology?
Yeah.
He connects it to this larger trend of fragmentation.
He does.
that we've been kind of dealing with for a long time.
Yeah, for decades now.
Yeah, with all those hyper-specialized subfields.
It's true.
It's hard to even talk to other sociologists sometimes,
I know.
let alone present a united front.
Exactly. And Beer sees punk sociology as like one possible antidote to all this fragmentation. He thinks it could help to bridge those divides and, create a more cohesive,
Right.
dare I say,
Yeah.
badass discipline.
It's like punk sociology is that jolt of electricity we need
Yes.
to get the heart of sociology pumping again.
I love that.
Now, Beer isn't the first one to call for a more, creative
Right.
and engaged kind of sociology.
Absolutely not.
He name drops people like C. Wright Mills,
Yeah.
who was all about connecting scholarly work to real-world issues.
Right. Public sociology avant la lettre.
And Howard Becker,
Yeah.
who was really championing a more ethnographic, street-level approach.
Absolutely.
So punk sociology isn't like this isolated rebellion.
No, it's not.
It's part of this larger lineage of sociologists trying to break free from the ivory tower.
I think that's a really good point. And he also aligns with scholars like Les Back, who advocate for a more public and participatory sociology, one that's less about detached observation and more about dialogue and collaboration.
Okay, so punk sociology isn't about, overthrowing everything that came before.
Mm-hmm.
It's building on those existing critiques and maybe pushing them a little bit further.
Yeah, taking it to the next level.
But how does punk sociology coexist with all those other approaches that are out there? I mean, not every sociologist is going to want to be a punk rocker.
Right, that's true. And maybe Beer doesn't expect everyone to, don a mohawk and start smashing the system.
Okay, good.
He sees punk sociology as a complement to, not a replacement for those other approaches.
Gotcha.
He argues for a more diverse sociology, really,
Okay.
recognizing that, different perspectives and methods can enrich our understanding of the social world.
So it's like this vibrant ecosystem where different approaches can kind of cross-pollinate and create something new and exciting.
I like that metaphor a lot.
Yeah.
And he even suggests that punk sociology can learn from those other approaches, too.
Oh, okay.
Borrowing techniques and insights to kind of sharpen its own analytical framework.
So it's not about creating this separate punk sociology camp.
Right.
But it's more about fostering a more dynamic and open dialogue
Yes.
across the whole discipline.
Exactly. Remember, he's not advocating for some, rigid dogmatic adherence to the punk ethos.
Right.
He encourages sociologists to adapt those principles to their own, research interests and contexts.
So there's room for a variety of punk sociology flavors,
There you go.
each with its own little twist.
I like that.
And ultimately, Beer sees punk sociology as an ongoing project,
Mm-hmm.
a work in progress,
Right.
that requires constant, reflection and adaptation. It's not about finding that one right way to do punk sociology, but it's constantly, experimenting,
Yeah.
pushing those boundaries and figuring out what works.
It's a very punk rock way to think about it.
Yeah, it's that never-ending mosh pit of ideas and challenges.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an awesome deep dive
It has been.
into punk
It's
sociology.
been a lot of fun.
We covered the core arguments,
We did.
the benefits, the pitfalls, and even how it kind of fits into this broader landscape
Yeah.
of the discipline.
And we learned that punk sociology is more than just a cool label.
Right.
It's really a call to action,
Exactly.
a challenge to rethink how we do sociology and what we can accomplish with it.
It's about bringing that passion, that energy, that critical spirit to everything we do as sociologists.
Absolutely. So let's all unleash our inner punk sociologist and get out there and shake things up.
Thanks for tuning in to Sociology Droids.